Good morning. We're going to just give a couple minutes for people to get logged in here. While we're waiting for people to get logged in, if people want to just maybe put their name and organization and where they're from in the chat, that would be great. We're just going to give maybe one more minute for people. The numbers are still going up here, so I want to let people get in here before we get started. It's exciting to see so many people who want to talk about taxes in the morning. Also exciting, lots of people from all over the state, so that's always cool too. All right, looks like we're steady with our number here. I'm sure some people will join late, but we'll go ahead and get started. It's always the don't want to punish people for being on time. My name is Heather Tritton. I'm the president and CEO of the Colorado Children's Campaign, and we are very excited to host this webinar with the Bell Policy Center, just bringing some awareness to some of the ballot initiatives that are expected this fall. And I'm gonna just kick this over to Scott Wasserman, who's the president of the Bell. And but before I do, just a little logistics, please, if you have questions, stick them in the chat, or better yet, put them in the Q&A, and I can ask questions as we go and interrupt Scott's presentation, or if it's something that you can wait until the end, we'll do a little Q&A at the end. So thank you all for being here, and Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it, Heather. Going to share my screen here. Hold on just a moment. All right, let's go to full presenter mode. Well, first of all, thank you, Heather and the Children's Campaign. Really appreciate this opportunity. This is actually the first time that we are doing a formal webinar on these disastrous ballot measures. So I appreciate the opportunity. One, I'm a procrastinator, and so I wasn't going to get this PowerPoint presentation done until midnight last night. So finally have had a chance to finish a first draft, and I'm excited to share it all with you. I'm also really excited that we're doing this and that there's so many people here. As I was just sharing with the Children Campaign team, we have got to get the message out early on these measures, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But with Initiatives 50 and 108, we cannot afford to wait until the fall to get the word out about these measures. Let me just start before I even get into this slide. Somebody on the team kind of asked me to talk about, and first of all, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Scott Wasserman. I'm the outgoing president of the Bell Policy Center. And pretty soon, as we move into July, I'll be moving over to the Bell Action Network, which is the Bell C4, to do some of the work that is needed to defeat these measures. And, you know, the Bell Policy Center, along with a lot of you, have been working on the property tax issue for a while. Some of you may be asking, why are we here? Why is any of this happening? And I could give you the long version, the medium version, or the short version. I think the short version that I'll give you is simply that in 2020, the state got rid of a 20 or 30-year limit that we had on residential property tax rates in the state. And when we got rid of that limit, and we got rid of it for some very good reasons, we unfortunately timed getting rid of that guard on residential property taxes right when the pandemic hit and right when property tax values skyrocketed in the May 22 assessment. And so for the last 3 years, all of you are probably aware that the state has been trying to figure out what to do about a couple of things. first of all, how do we deal with the property value spike that occurred and the increase in property tax bills, knowing that that is a temporary aberration? It's something we have to deal with nevertheless. The other thing that we've had to grapple with is that over the years, the Gallagher Amendment has created very high commercial property tax assessment rates. And while we have the third lowest residential property taxes in the country, the same can't be said for our commercial rates. And I think the third thing is we can't just, as you'll see in this, we can't just cut property tax rates. When we cut property tax rates, it has all kinds of disparate impacts across the state. Every community is different. And as you'll see, and I think as many of you know, we have a real challenge with K-12 funding in the state. And so much of K-12 funding really relies on local funding levels. And in fact, I'll just say before I get into this presentation, I think one of the greatest ironies of this legislative session was that on the one hand, people were talking about how we need to lower property taxes for those who saw a spike. And yet at the same time, we saw legislators celebrating paying down the negative factor, the state's deficit to schools. And the reason we were able to do that as a state was because of rising residential property values, and that helped the state close the gap. And so this is a really complicated issue. Today, I'm not going to focus so much on that history. I want to talk to you about the threat that we face. So to kick things off, and we're trying to build out kind of the narrative for how we got here. This legislative session in 2024, as many of you know, ended with a very historic bipartisan deal. And a lot of times we talk about a bipartisan deal and it was like one or two Republicans, and so we can call it bipartisan. But that was not the case at all with the 2024 legislative session. And what we saw at the end of that legislative session was that legislators, 92 out of 100 legislators, only 8 legislators in both chambers voted against Senate Bill 233, voted on a property tax relief deal that Coloradans can count on. And the deal did a few things, and I'll talk about it more in detail later, but it lowered statewide assessment rates. It came up with ways to target relief to those who need it most. It preserved K-12 funding levels, and it put a cap in place so that we can avoid future spikes. But I think one of the challenges that we have now is that while everyone in the building that was engaged in this understood that a compromise had been reached, what we are now seeing is that Colorado Concern, which is a wealthy developer group from downtown Denver, and conservative funders like Advance Colorado, they've said, well, we have a different idea. And what they're moving, as you will see, is just nothing short of a complicated disaster. And I think if we have any challenge with these measures, it's that the devastating impacts are unbelievable. And so I think we have a big hurdle to overcome and explain to people, no, these measures really are real. The consequences really will be disastrous, and we absolutely need to avoid these. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk a little bit about Initiative 50. So Initiative 50, first of all, it's a constitutional amendment. It has already qualified for the 24 ballot. Advance Colorado got their signatures for this very early in the cycle last summer, in fact, while Prop HH, which was another property tax measure, was on the ballot. So this has been qualified for the Constitution for a while. And Initiative 50 is simple but devastating. And what it does is it puts a 4% annual growth cap on total statewide property tax revenue across the state. And we're working on different images to try to convey exactly how this works. But the best image I could come up with is really from the Simpsons movie. It's just effectively putting a large dome over the entire state of Colorado, right? And here I just included the language because one of the things to understand about Initiative 50 and 108 is these are not very well thought out measures. And they put very general requirements, in this case, in the Constitution, that the legislature and policymakers are going to have a really difficult time figuring out how to actually implement. Initiative, and I'll come back to these in a second and talk more about them. Initiative 108 is statutory. They're currently in the field gathering signatures. Few things you need to know. First of all, on residential rates, dramatic reduction in statewide assessment rates, right? Had the legislature done nothing, we would have been at 7.15. They take WEGO, the lowest WEGO in the state in Senate Bill 233 was somewhere around we eventually end at like a 6.4, 6.5 assessment rate effectively. They drop assessment rates for residentials all the way down to 5.7. Non-residential rates go from 29 to 24% in one foul swoop. Really important to understand, their rate reductions in Initiative 108 do not start until property tax year 2025. They say nothing about what should happen in property tax year 2024, which is the year we're currently in, and the property taxes you'll be paying next year. Now, what's really crucial to understand about Initiative 108 is that it is a $3 billion loss to all the local districts across Colorado. About a third of total statewide property tax revenue will evaporate overnight in local districts. And the catch here is that Initiative 108 will require the state general fund to completely backfill all of those losses. And, the other side has started to waver and say, well, it's not all of those losses. But I want to point you to the language in Initiative 108, which you can see right here. And for those of you who are legislative nerds or know how to read legislation, there is no wiggle room, albeit it's statutory, there is no wiggle room in the language that they are putting in front of voters. The state treasurer shall issue a warrant to reimburse local districts for lost revenue. And so Initiative 108 does something that is really unfathomable, and we'll talk about it in a moment, which is really robbing Peter to pay Paul. A $3 billion cut to local governments across the state, with the state general fund being required by the voters, if this passes, to completely backfill those losses. Now, let's talk about Initiative 50. What would life look like under this 4% cap on total property tax revenue? First thing is I want to direct you over to the left. Brian Eason, who's a reporter for the Colorado Sun, really sharp guy, took a look at data from the last 40 years or so. And what he found was that just 15 times in the last 60 years, tax revenue had grown less than 4%, right? So if you think about how often Colorado would be over the Initiative 50 cap, it would pretty much be all of the time, right? And so this means, as we'll discuss, the state legislature or regular voters initiating every single cycle permission to go above the 4% cap. We also know that it has a terrible compounding effect. In the first year, it would maybe cut revenues by like 113 million. But by the third year, the losses for local communities tally at around $1 billion. The other thing that you need to think about is that total statewide property tax revenue throws everybody in the same boat. And so I want you to imagine, and we'll have a graphic eventually on this, I want you to imagine what a state like Colorado would have to grapple with. What happens when Denver's revenue goes up significantly, but Lamar's doesn't? What happens when Aspen's luxury home market goes up, right? And what it essentially does is it pits communities against one another. And it means that even though one community or one region did not see a steep increase in their revenue, it's too bad because other parts of the state saw an increase in their revenue. And so one of the biggest problems with Initiative 50 is in its most fundamental design, it is pitting communities against each other, and it is using total statewide property tax revenue as not just a metric for measuring, but actually as a metric for limiting the amount of revenue that communities can take in. The other thing, and we'll talk more about school funding, is that if you put this cap and you start to see revenue crowded out and revenue capacity limited, by about 2032, school districts will be about $1.38 billion behind what we know we need to do to avoid the budget stabilization factor. So the reality is, and I haven't even gotten to 108 yet, by putting this cap on total property tax revenue, by crowding everybody out, school districts are going to be competing with counties, are going to be competing with special metro districts, and that's going to have a major impact on the local share for schools. Finally, and this is something that hasn't been talked about quite a bit, this is going to cause massive bond market instability, because I want you all to imagine you're a local community, you put a bond mill on your ballot, the voters vote yes. Well, what happens if the next year there's not enough room under the statewide cap? They then have to go back to the voters and ask for permission from the state, not just their local government. And so already we're starting to hear from bond financing companies about the tremendous instability this creates, not only for just current bond obligations, but for any new bond obligations throughout the state. Another thing we did at the Bell Policy Center was we just said, well, what happens if we were to put Initiative 50 in place, say, starting in 2015? And let's look based on historic property tax revenues. This is what we're talking about in terms of cumulative loss, right? Somewhere around $16 billion of cumulative loss over the period of 7 years. $16 billion is equivalent to the total amount of property tax revenue we just collect in 1 year today. So these are massive compounding losses that will essentially eat at communities' ability to maintain revenue without voter permission. Now let's talk a little bit about Initiative 108. Heather, I see.
Yeah. Before you do that, we have a question about bond market instability. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, so let's think about this in a couple ways. First of all, every single community right now has a certain number of mills that are paying for bonds that have been taken out by communities to build large projects. Could be a water treatment plant. Oftentimes, housing developers use these bonds to build new housing. And if you think about it, if we start putting a lid on the total amount of property tax revenue in the state, and we start to crowd out communities' ability to retain revenue without statewide permission, that's going to start putting the bond payments from communities into jeopardy, right? And that's just for current bonds. But I think what's really alarming is the idea that if you wanted to go to your community for a new bond, you wanted to construct a school, you wanted to construct a new housing development, you don't just have to ask your community's voters now for permission. You actually have to make sure there is room statewide for the revenue to come in for your community. And so this either sets up a second vote by the entire state or requires the legislature to refer a measure to the people every single assessment cycle saying, we need this much room. And if your community didn't get in there and lobby and make sure that there's room for your bond payment, then that is going to cause huge uncertainty, which for the financial markets is kryptonite, right? And basically could lead to the state's bond rating going down or just communities not being able to find financing. I think what's really disturbing too is that as this state deals with housing insecurity and the lack of housing, well, many projects are funded by these kinds of financing mechanisms, right? And so we are taking a tool off the table. And I want to make it clear, no other state in the nation has a total statewide revenue limitation, right? There are limits on communities, there are limits on property values, but there are not limits on statewide property tax revenue across the state. So I'm happy to come back to that toward the end, but that's a little bit about what's going to happen in the bond market.
Awesome. I have one more question.
Yes. Yep.
Can you talk about how this all interacts with the new school funding formula?
Yeah, unfortunately, it really doesn't, right? And actually, one of the things, and I think you're referring to the legislation, fantastic legislation that I know the Children's Campaign and so many others worked on with Speaker McCluskey, Senator Lundeen. What those bills say is that if either of these measures go into place, those new funding mechanisms shut off. And that's by virtue of the fact, as you'll see shortly, that the state is going to be in a major financial crisis and is not going to have extra money from the state education fund in order to fund under the new funding mechanism. And so it's very important to understand that some of the great strides that were made this session, including a more equalized funding system for schools, that goes out the window if these measures pass. So I'm just going to keep moving along. Happy to take more questions toward the end. And I know this is weedy. We're doing our best to slim it down. So let's talk about Initiative 108. We throw around the phrase robbing Peter to pay Paul. This truly is what this is. So first of all, as I said earlier, a $3 billion cumulative loss to local governments just in year one from those rate reductions that I talked about, okay? And that's in every community, whether your community saw a huge jump in property tax revenues or saw no increase in property tax revenues, those revenues are going to be cut. And by requiring the state general fund to backfill $3 billion, we are talking about 18% of the state general fund. And I know there's a pretty savvy audience here, but one of the things that I hear out in the world or on Twitter is, well, we have a $40 billion budget. And I think as everyone on this call knows, that is just not true. The state only gets to manage about 16 billion of that $40 billion. And so that is where these dollars will have to come from. I lived through the Great Recession at the state capitol. I watched what happened. That was only an 11% cut to the state general fund, and that was pretty dramatic. So first and foremost, we are talking about a humongous chunk of the general fund, and I'll talk more about that in a second. The second thing is, one of the things that the proponents of Initiative 108 are saying is, well, don't worry, your schools are protected, right? Because what they're saying is that we'll cut school district revenues, but the state will backfill it. First of all, I think that that's incredibly, it's quite an audacious statement, right? Because even as I talked about earlier, Initiative 50 is going to increasingly lower the ceiling on allowable revenue for school districts, thereby lowering local share, increasing the general fund need, right? But the other thing is that as the state starts to have to make tough choices, right? Do we backfill schools? Do we backfill fire? I think we have to ask ourselves very realistically whether or not the state is going to be able to do both at the same time. And I think when the state has to backfill the losses from the general fund, then you can kiss goodbye any increased funding for schools. And so I think it's a very audacious claim. And while it's written in the legislation, there really is no practical way to protect schools when we are playing Hunger Games between state services and local services, and not just state services and local services, but local services and local services. The other thing, and I think this is something that we all on this call understand, is that very often the services that schools provide depend a great deal on state services. What is the point of having a school system if you don't have a higher education system? What is the point of having a school system if you don't have a local human services department and a state human services department to meet the needs of kids? I think these are things that we get that we have to explain to the larger public. And I think at the end of the day, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, it is really unclear how this goes. No state has ever tried to swap out $3 billion of state revenue for local revenue. And I think ultimately what will happen in future years is that state programs and services will be pit against local programs and services. And so it truly is an unsustainable, complicated mess, as if we didn't already have those messes from some of our fiscal adventures of the past. Let's talk a little bit about these cuts. So I think everyone should tune into the revenue forecast that's going to be this Thursday at the state capitol, because last Friday, OSPB Director Mark Ferrandino gave a presentation to the Property Tax Commission in which he started to actually think through, what will these cuts look like? What does it mean to cut $3 billion from the state general fund? And you can see here his first shot. He had a couple of slides, but I just wanted to show you, this is what a $3 billion cut to the state budget looks like, right? And in some cases, there are programs that aren't even eligible for cutting, right? The programs that are in red, as many of you know, there are legal obstacles, there are actual challenges with whether or not we can actually cut some of these funds. And you'll see here, right? Early childhood. We've added a number of expansions. We've funded new programs. Much of that money would ultimately go away if the state is forced to backfill $3 billion. In other cases, we can't just cut $193 million from corrections. There are legal obligations, human services, or HICPUF. We would need to get federal approval. But this is precisely the situation that we would find ourselves. And I think one of the biggest, and you'll see here, because we would need to target, and there's probably one other slide I should add here, higher ed is going to absolutely get killed. I think, as all of us know, they have the least legal protection. And so rather than cut healthcare policy and finance, right, rather than cut human services or corrections, the state is much more likely to cut higher education. But even if they eliminated the entire higher education budget, they're only halfway there. So again, as I said in the beginning, it almost sounds unbelievable, but this is precisely what is being proposed at the ballot this year. I'm not going to get too into this in this presentation, but I think one of the things that's really important to stress is that we do have a challenge with property taxes, right? For many people in the state, particularly in the metro area, particularly in the mountain area, they have seen very steep increases in their property taxes, right? And so the legislature has worked on this problem. We continue to hear from the opposition, well, the legislature has ignored it. The legislature is in charge of the increase. First of all, these are local property taxes, and the only thing the state legislature controls are assessment rates. And just look at from 2022 through 2026, the number of changes that the state legislature is making to property tax assessment rates and downgrading them. So while people will still see increases in their property tax bills because of higher values, they're going to see very significantly lower increases. And that is all because of the actions that the legislature has taken, including in the last legislative session with Senate Bill 233. Here, I just take a little bit of a deep dive into Senate Bill 233. There's a lot in this chart, but I think some things just to be clear. We are putting a cap on local communities and saying that local community revenues cannot grow more than 5.5%. Now, by the way, that is the kind of cap that makes sense. It is specific to the community. It is something that voters themselves can override if they want to, and it adjusts every year for inflation and things like that, right? We also, as you can see here, you can see how we're lowering the state assessment rate, lowering those commercial rates, but not tearing off the Band-Aid and doing it from 27.9 or 29% to 24 overnight, right? But by doing it gradually. The other thing, and this is so key because I know that schools are very critical for this audience, right, is that we split the assessment rate for school districts and for non-school districts because we cannot afford to mess around when it comes to school district revenues. And so you see that the assessment rate will be a new blended one, right? And we're doing that to protect schools. So the compromise in Senate 233, I think, really illustrates how when Republicans and Democrats got together and really talked about this in a real way, they realized that they could not sacrifice school revenues and that this kind of thing was needed. And so this is the package that we're going to be talking about more during the campaign because it's really important to contrast relief that you know is coming, that is certain, right, versus the destructive chaos that is promised through 50 and 108. So, I mean, that's where I'm going to end here today, and I'm happy to take your questions. I really think, in every political campaign, contrast is important. We know that. And to me, the choice is very clear and the contrast is very clear. On the one hand, we can continue the property tax relief that the legislature passed for 2024, making sure that we are reducing that property tax spike that people are dealing with. We can lower the assessment rates in the future. It's already law. School funding can be protected, and we can have responsible revenue growth caps for local communities. And those are all things that the legislature has voted yes on, Republicans and Democrats both. Or we can absolutely roll the dice, okay? And we can have massive confusion over how to calculate that statewide 4% cap. Didn't even get into all the technocratic problems there. We can have constant uncertainty over whether communities have room under this cap. We can have intensive Hunger Game lobbying by local communities at the state level. And we can have great recessionary level cuts to state funding for a broad spectrum of services and programs. And that's really the contrast between these measures and what the legislature has passed. I'll just finish up here and say, pretty soon we're going to be launching a campaign. Coloradans for Local Communities is going to be the name of the issue campaign. We're going to have a website soon. We need your help. We need you to write op-eds, letters to the editor. We need you to spread the word on social media, educate your community, host a presentation like this. A lot of this is going to be about our ground game and making sure that communities understand the complexity and the unintended consequences or intended consequences of 50 and 108. And we need to make sure that everyone just absolutely, no matter how you feel, and here's the thing I'll just say, no matter how you feel about the property tax situation, maybe Senate Bill 233 wasn't enough for you. does it make any sense in the world to take a risk on these kinds of proposals instead? And I think when, we've done now 2 polls, and it is very clear, and I guess I'll end on this note. The other side is saying, well, these proposals are inevitable. Coloradans are going to vote for them, no problem. We have polled in the field twice, and we know without question that is not true. When Coloradans understand exactly what these complexities are, these measures do not get the support they need. In fact, even after messaging on both sides, Initiative 50 does not cross 52%. It needs 55%. So these ballot measures are not inevitable. We can defeat them. We need to get the word out, and we need to make sure that people who care about both state and local governments don't fall for this ruse, and that we are able to beat these in the fall. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. Happy to take questions, go back and talk about anything, or just get some feedback for you, because this is really the first time that we are doing this kind of a public presentation.
Thank you, Scott. That was great. We do have one question, and I want to say, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask a question. But the question we have right now is, can you provide some specifics about how you believe early childhood funding will be impacted?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just from a general fund perspective, I mean, we have the Joint Budget Committee has made a number of additional general fund appropriations for early childhood. And while, universal pre-K is funded by a specific revenue stream, there's an awful lot of programming, both within K-12 and then in the early childhood space, that relies on general fund. And in most cases, those are not legally, right? When I say legally protected, like, for instance, you can't just cut Medicaid without federal authorization. You can't cut corrections because you have to meet caseload needs, right? That's not the case for early childhood. And so just straight off the bat, what I would say is that any general fund increases that have gone to early childhood will be among the first to be considered, because there are very few protections against cutting those funds. So that's right off the bat. I would also say, a number of communities have set up special districts around the state that rely on property tax revenue to fund expanded early childhood services. This is going to impact every single district across the state and mess around with those numbers. Even if the special district isn't being funded by property taxes, most local governments have a mix of revenues, sales tax. If your property tax revenue suddenly goes, down, right, then you're going to have to compensate that maybe with more sales tax, or you're just going to have to cut programming. So I think that's something, and I saw that Sarah put together a very interesting piece on the impacts of these measures. But I think we really do have to look at, over the last couple of years, what were the big expansions of general fund spending in this area. And then I think this is just going to throw K-12 funding into absolute chaos. Maybe if these pass in the first year, the state is somehow able to backfill K-12, but that is completely unsustainable moving forward. And as we all know, there's a huge connection between K-12 education and early childhood outcomes. So I do not understand why anyone would want to throw this entire system into chaos, but that is what will happen.
Thank you. Yeah, it doesn't seem good for early childhood or K-12. So a lot of concern there. Can you talk a little bit more about when the no campaign will start, and what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are a week away from having a very streamlined website with all of these kind of facts and information and resources available to you. I was a little bummed not to have it ready for today. The Bell Action Network is trying to take a role in launching some of the most basic things that a campaign will need. We do know that there are a number of funders, and that's what I would say. I mean, I committed the one sin that you're never supposed to commit when you do these, which is to ask for money. I mean, the bottom line is, we got a picture of what the other side's budget looks like. They are intending to spend $8 million to pass these ballot measures. We need our institutional funders and partners to really step up here. It is going to take, contributions in units of $250,000 or more for us to get to this goal. I think we need to raise about $4 million for our campaign. So I suspect next week we'll be launching our website. It'll be very easy to sign up to volunteer. We need a speakers bureau. We're also trying to organize webinars like this. I was just talking to Evie Hudak. We're going to do the PTA in July. we need to get in front of higher education. So like right now, if you, work in a community like that, we would love to present to you. So I think campaign will be stood up in just a few weeks. And I think, and I'll just say this is that we've got to get organized a little earlier. And there's two reasons for that. One is we just can't afford to wait. But I think the more important thing, and this is kind of a little insider baseball, but the reality is that, and every day I kind of have to pinch myself, like not pinch myself because that suggests something good, but like, are they really suggesting this? I mean, these are so-called leaders of the community, executives that have championed early childhood, have championed workforce training. They can't really be serious. And what I think is also happening is that, and you will hear this from them, is, well, we need the governor to call a special session so we can all get back in the Capitol and negotiate something better, right? So I think part of this, and you will hear this from proponents, is, well, if you don't want something bad to happen to your state, well, get us back in the building. I would really ask you to talk to anyone involved in those negotiations, whether it was Representative Degree Kennedy, Senator Hansen, Senator Kirkmeyer, Representative Frizzell, Democrats and Republicans. What would the other side have us do differently? Everything we did was precisely negotiated to make sure that the state budget could handle it. And so I think that it's very important for us to demonstrate that there's no way that we're going to go negotiate something else. If they want to put this on the ballot, we're going to fight it, we're going to oppose it, and we're going to defeat it. So to answer your question, campaign website will be up very soon. And please contact Heather if you want to get involved. She can get that information to me. We're going to be putting together an advisory committee, steering committee for funders. But right now, I think we are in fundraising mode and we need to get the message out. And we also need to make sure that a lot of the folks who, I think in particular, there are higher ed presidents who said, well, maybe we really don't need to fight these measures. Maybe we can figure something out. I don't think that's the case. And if it is the case, we're going to have to make very painful concessions that are going to hurt many of the things we care about.
Thank you. Can you talk at all about the plans for grassroots organizing or canvassing?
Those are still in development. And I think that we want this to be a truly grassroots campaign. And so I think from our perspective, we're going to make sure that you have all the fact sheets, talking points at your disposal. We want to make sure we have a speakers bureau, because from our experience, there is an education community, there's an early childhood community. The best people to galvanize them are you. So all of that is still in development. I'd be lying if I said we had a plan. But what I would say is that we're going to be relying on people like you to be getting this out. We also need polite society, if you will, right? The folks who, host webinars, who host meetings in their living rooms. We need them to know about this, whether or not they host an event with the campaign. Like, we need them to be spreading the word. So what I would say, and right now there's actually on the Bell Policy Center website, before the campaign website is launched, that we have some great resources on the Bell Policy Center that you can use right now. And maybe somebody could post that in the chat. It's right on our front page. So more details coming soon. But what I would say is, if you're interested in participating in the campaign and being involved in the development of the grassroots plan, let Heather know, and then we'll be in touch with you.
All right. Doesn't look like we have any other questions right now. So I just want to say thank you for doing this. Thank you for leading on this conversation and pushing us to get organized early. I think you are right when you say this could have devastating effects on our state budget, and that means devastating effects on children in Colorado. And we really need to do whatever we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. So thank you for leading on this. And if people have questions later, please reach out to me. I put my email in the chat. I also put the Bell Policy Center's website, so please feel free to reach out. Oh, we also put in the chat the blog post that Sarah wrote. So yep. Check it all out.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for being here. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care.